My name is Harrison. I'm a 68-year-old widower and an engineer. My son-in-law, Joseph, slapped me across the face in my own home hard enough to loosen a tooth. He thought he had broken an old man's spirit, but he forgot. An engineer always knows how to find the hairline crack in a structure that looks perfect on the outside. Have you ever looked at something you built with your own two hands, a birdhouse, a garden, maybe a whole house, and felt like you were looking at more than just wood and nails, but a piece of your own life? Hello, my friends. Thanks for tuning in. Wherever you are, whether it's in your garage, on your drive home, or sitting in your favorite armchair, let me know you're here with a comment. My name is Harrison, and this is my story. I was in my workshop. It's the one place on this earth I still feel Margaret, my late wife, standing right beside me. The air itself is a memory, thick with the scent of pine shavings and the clean metallic smell of machine oil. I was working on an old rocking chair, restoring it. It was the one my daughter, Destiny, had claimed as her own when she was just a little girl, back when her feet dangled a good foot off the floor. My hands might not be as quick as they once were, the knuckles a little thicker, the grip not quite as firm, but they still know the work. They know the language of wood. Every smooth pass of the hand plane, every turn of the screwdriver that sinks a screw perfectly flush, it's an affirmation. It's a quiet reminder that in this small world, under this one roof, I am still in control. My daughter Destiny was coming for dinner with her husband Joseph. I've always had a knot in my gut about that boy. There's a polish to him that's a little too bright, a smile that's quick to his lips but never ever seems to travel north to his eyes. But Destiny loves him, and for her, I've tried. Lord knows I've tried. I ran my hand over the smooth, sanded arm of the rocker one last time, feeling the history and the grain. With a satisfied sigh, I carried it out to the front porch, placing it right where Margaret used to sit to watch the sunset, hoping Destiny would see it and remember. Joseph arrived with his arm draped over Destiny's shoulder, a gesture that looked more like ownership than affection. He breezed past me with a quick, "Hey, Harrison," and made a beeline for the garden spigot, the one I'd noticed had a slow drip just yesterday. I'd already planned to take a look at it this weekend. He fiddled with it for a moment, then came back inside, walking not to me, but to my daughter. He held up a small, worn-out rubber washer between his thumb and forefinger, like a trophy. "It was just the washer, honey," he said, his voice dripping with a kind of practiced patience. "You know, your dad's probably getting a little forgetful with these things. You should remind him not to tackle dangerous jobs like this anymore. That's what plumbers are for." I felt a hot flush creep up my neck and spread across my face. Dangerous? I built this house from the foundation up with my own two hands. I wired every room and plumbed every pipe. But I held my tongue. I looked at Destiny, who gave me a weak, apologetic smile, and I didn't want to put her in the middle of it, so I just stood there, silent. He was doing it again, painting me as a doddering old fool in front of my own daughter. It wasn't the first time he'd planted these little seeds of doubt, these little jabs wrapped in a bow of concern. But this time, the sting felt sharper, the intent clearer than ever. Dinner was a masterclass in false pleasantries. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the only sound the clinking of our silverware against the plates Margaret had picked out decades ago. Joseph filled the silence, rambling on about his friends, about how they'd all had the foresight to move their parents into what he called high-end senior living communities. He made them sound like resorts, not waiting rooms for the inevitable. Then, while Destiny was clearing the plates, he leaned forward, his elbows on my dining table. He looked me right in the eye. "Harrison," he started, his voice lowered to that intimate conspiratorial tone he used when he was about to deliver a blow. "We're just really concerned about your health and safety, you being all alone in this big house." I set my fork down on the table with a soft click. I knew exactly where this was headed. It's just not practical anymore, he continued, his gaze unwavering. Moving somewhere with dedicated care would be a better fit. It would be what's best for you. We could manage the house for you. My chest tightened. Manage. The word hung in the air like poison. He didn't just want to help, he wanted my house. He wanted the home I'd built for my wife, the home I'd raised my daughter in. He said it all as if he were doing me the greatest favor, as if stripping me of my life's work, my legacy, was an act of charity for my own good. I looked past him, to my daughter. I searched her face for a sign, any sign of protest, a flicker of indignation in her eyes. I needed to see that she was still on my side, that she saw through this charade. But she wouldn't meet my gaze. Destiny just stared down at the pattern on her plate, her shoulders hunched slightly. Her silence was his victory, and her silence hurt me more than his brazen, greedy words ever could. Had she already bought into it? Did my own daughter see me as a burden, a problem to be solved? Had Joseph's quiet poison finally seeped in, convincing her that her own father was no longer competent enough to steer his own ship? In that moment, at my own table, I felt like a stranger. I didn't say a word. I just quietly pushed my chair back, stood up, and walked to my workshop. I needed a space where I could still breathe my own air. I didn't sleep that night. Joseph's voice echoed in my head, a smug, looping track of condescension. Manage the house, not practical. What's best for you? He wasn't just after the property. He was after my dignity. He wanted to erase me, to render me powerless and irrelevant before I was even gone. I swung my legs out of bed and walked downstairs in the dark, the old floorboards groaning under my feet like old friends. I stopped in front of the fireplace and looked at the wedding photo of Margaret and me on the mantel. Her smile. It could light up a whole room. What would you do, Maggie? I thought. She wouldn't have stood for it, not for a second. She would have seen right through him and cut him down with a few choice words. I will not let this happen. I'm not some fragile old man to be managed. I'm an engineer, and I was going to handle this the way an engineer would, calmly, methodically, and by understanding every last detail of the problem. My silent journey had begun. A few days went by. The unease from that dinner settled in my bones, a low, persistent ache. Then Joseph showed up, unannounced, with that same wide, empty smile plastered on his face. He had a reason, of course. He always had a reason. This time, it was to help Dad clean up a few things. Before I could even offer him a coffee, he'd picked up my cell phone from the kitchen counter. He turned it over in his hands like it was some ancient, baffling artifact. "This thing is running pretty slow, Harrison," he said, already swiping through my screens. "Probably clogged with junk. Let me take a look, clear it out for you." A prickle of annoyance went through me. I don't like people touching my things. A man's tools are his own, whether they're made of steel or silicon. But I held back the words. My generation, we were taught that a man handles his own problems, quietly. But we were also taught to keep the peace in the family, to not make waves, so I just nodded. While he sat at my kitchen table, his thumbs tapping away at the glass, I went out to the yard to mow the lawn. The roar of the old John Deere was a comfort. It's a sound I've known for 30 years, a steady, reliable rumble. Pushing the mower back and forth in straight, satisfying lines, the smell of freshly cut grass filling the air, I could almost convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe I was being a suspicious old fool. Maybe the boy was just trying to help. Maybe this was how the new generation showed they cared, not by fixing a leaky faucet, but by cleaning up your digital clutter. The trouble started later that week. I was in my armchair, the house quiet, and I decided to call Frank. We had a standing date to go fishing on Saturdays, and I wanted to see if he was still on for this weekend. I picked up my phone, went to my contacts, and scrolled down to the F's. He wasn't there. That's odd, I thought. I scrolled through the whole list. No Frank. I searched for Jim, my buddy from the VFW hall. Gone. I looked for the number for the Veterans Club itself. Vanished. Dozens of names, dozens of friendships built over decades of shared jokes, hardships, and quiet understanding. All of it just erased. A cold wave of panic started in my stomach and washed over me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to pull Frank's number from my memory. For the life of me, I couldn't. The number was just a blank space in my mind. And in that blank space, Joseph's voice echoed, getting a little forgetful. Could it be true? Was my mind really failing me? Just then, the landline on the end table rang, loud and shrill in the silent house. I reached for it, a surge of relief washing through me. But before my hand could even touch the receiver, I heard Joseph's voice from the kitchen. He and Destiny had let themselves in. "I got it!" he called out. I heard him answer, his voice smooth as oil. "Oh, hey, Frank. Yeah, he's here, but he's taking a nap right now. He's been sleeping a lot lately. Yeah, I'll be sure to tell him you called." He hung up the phone and walked into the living room, smiling at me. "That was your friend Frank," he said. "I told him you were resting." He was building a wall around me, brick by invisible brick, and using my own daughter's concern as the mortar. The next day, I tried to explain it to Destiny. I sat her down at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd taught her to do her homework, and I told her about the contacts. She listened, her brow furrowed. But when I was done, she looked at me with an expression that broke my heart. It was a look of deep, profound worry. "Oh, Dad," she said, her voice soft and gentle. "You probably just deleted them by accident. These new smartphones can be so complicated." Her tone was kind, but the meaning was clear as day. She thought I was losing my mind. Joseph had done it. His campaign had been a success. He had planted the seed of doubt in my own daughter, and it had taken root. I felt a profound sense of helplessness wash over me. What could I say? Every word of protest, every attempt to explain would just be another symptom in their eyes. The more I fought, the more confused I would seem. I sat there long after she left, staring out the window. The world outside looked the same. The sun was shining. The neighbor was walking his dog. But I felt like I was drifting away from it all, being sealed inside my own home by whispers and lies. I didn't ask Destiny for help with anything technical after that. Instead, I went to the drugstore and bought a small, spiral-bound notebook and a pack of pens. I started writing everything down, phone numbers I could remember, appointments, things I needed from the store. It was my own small act of defiance, a way to prove to myself that I was still all there. Sitting at my desk, I remembered the days Margaret and I spent building this place. We did it all ourselves, from pouring the concrete for the foundation to nailing the last shingle on the roof. Every inch of this house, every stud in the walls and every tile on the floor was soaked in our sweat and our dreams. This house isn't just an asset, it's a witness. It's the story of my life, and I would not let him take it, not even if he was trying to convince the world and me that I was no longer the man who built it. You know, for our generation, a contact list was built over a lifetime. Every name held a story. Have you ever felt that connection slipping away, not because you wanted it to, but because someone else thought they knew what was best for you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Later that week, while sorting through a box of old tax documents, my fingers brushed against a piece of cardstock. It was a business card, yellowed with age. Miller and Sons, Private Investigative Services. I'd hired them years ago, long before the internet, to track down an old army buddy. I had no idea if they were even still in business, but looking at the faded print, I felt the first flicker of something I hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Maybe I wasn't entirely alone in this fight after all. I carefully slipped the card into my wallet, tucking it behind my driver's license. It was a backup plan, an emergency exit only I knew existed, and having that one small secret made me feel just a little bit stronger. The doorbell rang on a Tuesday afternoon. The sound cut through the quiet of the house, sharp and unwelcome. I wasn't expecting anyone. I put my book down and walked to the door, a vague sense of unease already stirring. When I opened it, Joseph was standing on my porch, grinning. Beside him stood another man, a complete stranger in a tailored suit, holding a leather-bound notebook. "Hey, Harrison," Joseph said, his voice offensively cheerful. "This is my friend Mark. He's an architect. He heard me talking about the house and was just dying to see the craftsmanship up close. A real admirer of your generation's work." A dull, familiar annoyance began to thrum under my skin. My house isn't a museum. It's my home. But before I could form a polite refusal, Joseph had already placed a hand on the small of the man's back, guiding him past me over my own threshold. "Don't you mind us, Harrison. We'll only be a minute." He moved with the easy entitlement of a man who believed he owned any room he walked into. And in that moment, in my own hallway, I was made to feel like the groundskeeper. The man, Mark, did not move like an admirer. Admirers walk slowly, their hands behind their backs. They look up at ceiling beams and comment on the joinery. This man moved like a surgeon. His eyes weren't filled with appreciation. They were scanning, calculating. He walked through my home while I followed a few paces behind, a silent ghost in my own life. In his hand, he held a small device that shot out a thin red line of light, a laser measure. He measured the width of the living room, the height of the ceilings, jotting down numbers in his notebook with brisk, efficient strokes of a pen. He tapped on the drywall with his knuckles, listening to the sound. He took photos with his phone, the clinical flash momentarily washing out the warm colors Margaret and I had chosen so carefully. This wasn't a tour. This was an appraisal. This was an inventory. Joseph trailed after him like a proud auctioneer, pointing out features. "You could knock this wall out, open up the whole space," I heard him murmur. And later, by the large picture window that looks out over the garden, "This view alone is a premium." The blood started to pound in my ears. They were dissecting my life's work. They were pacing out the dimensions of my memories and assigning them a market value right here in front of me. This was a violation more profound than any insult. It was the calm, methodical erasure of everything that made this house a home. I couldn't stand it a second longer. As the man, Mark, aimed his little red light at the hearth, the very hearth where I'd proposed to Margaret, I stepped in front of him. I put a hand up, not touching him, but blocking his path. "That's enough," I said. My voice was low, but it was as steady as the foundation of the house itself. "I think it's time for you to leave." Joseph was at my side in an instant, but he didn't speak to me. He turned, saw Destiny coming out of the kitchen with 2 glasses of water, and he grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the scene he had created. He pitched his voice just loud enough for me to hear every treacherous word, his tone soaked in feigned concern. "See, honey, this is what I was talking about. He's overreacting again. I told him Mark was stopping by last week, but I guess he doesn't remember." It was a lie. A bald-faced, venomous lie crafted on the spot, and it was brilliant in its cruelty. He was using my own righteous anger, my own defense of my home, as the primary exhibit for his case against me. He was twisting my sanity into a weapon and pointing it at my own head. In one clean motion, he had transformed me from the master of the house into the madman in the attic. But the worst part, the part that truly drove the knife in, was the look on Destiny's face. She looked at me, and what I saw in her eyes wasn't anger. It wasn't disbelief. It was pity. A deep, sorrowful, and soul-crushing pity. She believed him. In her eyes, her father was no longer a competent man defending his home. I was a poor, confused old man, lost in the fog of my own mind, lashing out at shadows only I could see. This was his masterpiece of manipulation. It left no bruises, no visible scars. It just hollowed me out from the inside, leaving me utterly, completely alone. My daughter was no longer on my side of the wall, not out of malice, but because the architect of lies had blinded her. After they left with a flurry of placating words and worried glances, the silence they left behind was deafening. The house felt wrong. It felt cold. The warmth, the sense of sanctuary that had been infused into its very walls over 50 years, felt like it had been vacuumed out by their presence. I walked from room to room, the echo of my own footsteps sounding foreign. I ran my hand along the wall in the hallway, the wall Margaret and I had painted a sunny yellow one weekend in the spring of '78. I sat in the armchair I'd built in my workshop, the one that fits my body perfectly. Everything was the same, but the feeling of safety, the fundamental belief that this was my space, was gone. I knew then that I couldn't just weather this storm. I couldn't just wait for it to pass. I had to fight. I had to find something real, something tangible. I had to find facts that couldn't be twisted, truths that couldn't be painted over with the brush of pity. An engineer doesn't give up when a structure is unsound. He finds the stress points, he understands the forces at play, and he draws up a new blueprint. And this was the biggest structural problem of my life. It happened a few days later. Destiny and Joseph stopped by to pick up a box of old winter clothes Destiny had been storing in the attic. Joseph was in the middle of a story when his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, swore under his breath, and said, "I have to take this. Work emergency." He rushed out to his car, leaving his laptop open and humming on my kitchen table. My heart gave a single, hard thump against my ribs. I stood frozen in the doorway, listening. I could hear Destiny upstairs, the muffled sound of her moving boxes around. I could hear the murmur of Joseph's voice from the driveway, and in the space between those sounds, there was this open laptop, its screen glowing with opportunity. Everything in my life, every principle I'd ever lived by, told me to turn around and walk away. A man's privacy is his own. I had never, in 80 years, gone through another person's private things. Not my wife's, not my daughter's. It was a line you just didn't cross. But then I thought of the man with the laser measure in my living room. I thought of the pity in my daughter's eyes. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the normal rules no longer applied. I was not in a gentleman's disagreement. I was in a fight for my life, and this might be my only chance to see the enemy's battle plans. With one last glance toward the stairs, I moved quickly, my worn house slippers silent on the linoleum. I sat down in front of the bright screen. I'm not a computer whiz by any stretch, but I've learned a few things over the years. I know how to find the browser history. I clicked the icon, and a list appeared. What I saw there made the air in my lungs turn to ice. It wasn't just one or two suspicious searches. It was a blueprint, a detailed step-by-step guide to dismantling a man. How to sell an elderly parent's home. Legal process for guardianship cognitive decline. Early signs of dementia versus normal memory loss. And then the one that felt like a physical blow, the one that stole my breath entirely. how to convince a loved one they need managed care. I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. This wasn't a passing thought he'd had. This wasn't a fleeting, ugly impulse. This was research. This was a methodical, calculated plan. He wasn't just after my house. He was building a legal cage for me, and he was using the language of love and concern as the bait for the trap. He was going to have me declared incompetent, a man who couldn't be trusted with his own affairs, and the law would hand him the keys not just to my front door, but to my entire existence. The anger I'd felt before was a hot, righteous thing. This was different. This was a cold, profound revulsion. I wasn't a person to him. I wasn't his wife's father. I was a project, a specimen to be analyzed and managed. Every condescending word, every feigned act of help, every little jab at my memory, it was all part of this script he was running. He was actively trying to manufacture the very symptoms he was researching online. He was trying to turn me into a textbook case, a confused old man, incapable of making his own decisions, a burden who needed to be put away for his own good. This wasn't an attack on my property anymore. This was an attack on my very identity. He wanted to erase Harrison Davies, the engineer, the husband, the father, and leave behind nothing but a diagnosis on a form. As a man, you're taught to fix things. You fix the leaky faucet, you fix the broken fence, you fix the car. But what do you do when the problem isn't a busted pipe, but a poison that's being dripped into your family's heart? Have you ever faced something you knew couldn't be solved with a hammer and wrench, but only with quiet, patient, and methodical gathering of facts? Let me know your story in the comments. My hands were trembling. The same hands that could draft intricate mechanical blueprints, that could rebuild a carburetor from scratch, were now shaking so badly I could barely operate my own phone. I pulled it from my pocket and forced my fingers to be still. I aimed the camera at the screen and took a picture. Click. And another. Click. Each quiet sound felt like a gunshot in the silent kitchen. One by one, I documented every damning line of text, and as I did, a strange calm settled over me. The fog of fear and confusion that had clouded my mind for weeks began to burn away, replaced by the cold, clear light of certainty. The engineer inside me woke up. For an engineer, chaos is unacceptable. You break a problem down into its components. You gather data. You understand the forces you're up against. And that's what this was. A problem. And now I had data. I had evidence. The vague sense of being under attack was gone. Now I knew the precise nature of the threat. I closed the browser, cleared the history of my own visit, and gently shut the laptop lid, just seconds before Joseph walked back into the kitchen, smelling of the outdoors and false sincerity. He didn't notice a thing. I looked up at him from the table. I even managed a small, polite smile. "Everything all right?" I asked. But on the inside, a fundamental shift had occurred. A tectonic plate had moved deep within my soul. I no longer saw him as my difficult son-in-law. He was an opposing force, a structural flaw that threatened the integrity of my entire world. The ambiguity was over. The battle lines were drawn. And in my wallet, the old faded business card from Miller & Sons suddenly felt warm against my hip. It was time to make a call. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I drove to a diner a few towns over, a place with cracked vinyl booths and a jukebox that hadn't worked since the 90s. I couldn't make the call from my house. The thought, as strange as it was, felt necessary. I didn't know how far Joseph's schemes went, whether he'd figured out a way to listen in on my calls. It felt absurd, like something out of a spy movie, to have to act with such caution in my own life. But the old certainties were gone. I sat in the driver's seat of my Ford, the engine ticking as it cooled in the parking lot. I stared at the business card for Miller and Sons. The cardboard was soft and worn at the edges, a relic from another time. To call a stranger and lay bare my family's problems went against the grain of every lesson I'd ever been taught. You handle your own affairs. You don't air your dirty laundry. But the alternative, silence, was no longer an option. Silence was surrender. I took a long, slow breath, feeling the rough texture of the card against my fingertips, a small, tangible piece of a world I hoped still existed. Then I dialed the number. A voice answered on the second ring. It was a low baritone, calm and unhurried. Miller Investigations. There was no judgment in it, no curiosity. It was the voice of a man who simply answered the phone because it was his job, and it was, in that moment, the most reassuring sound I had ever heard. He suggested we meet at a public park. Neutral ground. When I arrived, I saw a man sitting on a park bench, tossing breadcrumbs from a paper bag to a flock of pigeons. He looked like me, a little older maybe, with the same weathered look of a man who'd spent more time outdoors than in. He could have been anyone's grandfather, but his eyes, when he looked up at me, were sharp and missed nothing. This was Miller. I sat down, leaving a respectable distance between us. I felt a wave of awkwardness wash over me, but I didn't start with complaints or emotional appeals. I started with facts. I laid out the events methodically, like I was presenting a technical report on a structural failure. I talked about the faucet, the deleted phone contacts, the man who called himself an architect. Then I took out my phone and showed him the pictures, the screenshots of Joseph's search history. He took the phone from me, his movements deliberate. He scrolled through each image, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the quiet of a professional absorbing data, and it gave me the profound feeling of being taken seriously. When he was done, he handed the phone back to me and looked me square in the eye. "Mr. Davies," he said, his voice even, "you're not the first man to tell me a story like this. The names change, the details are a little different, but the blueprint is always the same." Hearing those words felt like a physical weight being lifted from my shoulders. It was a validation so powerful, it almost brought tears to my eyes. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't senile. What was happening to me was real. It had a name, and it had happened to others. Miller explained that predators like Joseph are systematic. They begin by eroding your confidence, isolating you from your support system, and only then do they make their move. "You did exactly the right thing," he said, tapping my phone. "You gathered evidence." For the first time in weeks, in what felt like an eternity, I didn't feel alone. Miller took my case. He said the first step was to find out who Joseph was before he became my son-in-law. "A fox," he said with a wry little smile, "never raids just one henhouse." He had a condition for me, though. I was to go home and do nothing. I was to continue playing the part Joseph had cast for me. "Be the forgetful old man he wants you to be," Miller instructed. "The more helpless you appear, the more careless he'll get." It was difficult advice to swallow. It meant choking down my anger, biting my tongue when every instinct screamed to fight back. But I understood the engineering of it. This was a long game now. I had to outthink him, not just outmuscle him. I paid his initial fee in cash right there on the bench. There was no receipt, no paperwork, just a firm, dry handshake that felt more binding than any contract. The drive home was different. The sky seemed a brighter shade of blue. The air coming through the open window felt cleaner. I pulled into my driveway and looked at my house. It no longer felt like a cage or a place of ambush. It felt like my fortress, a piece of ground I now had a strategy to defend. I had an ally. I had a plan. The gnawing fear that had been my constant companion had been replaced by a quiet, sharp focus. Joseph might think he was running circles around a tired old man. He had no idea that this old engineer was finally drawing up his own set of blueprints. Joseph's audacity grew with each passing day. He was like a weed, taking root wherever there was a patch of bare earth. A few days after my meeting with Miller, he and Destiny came over for dinner. He waited until Destiny was clearing the plates before he casually tossed a folded piece of paper onto the table in front of me. It was an invoice from a roofing company for several $1,000s. "Just so you have it for your records, Harrison," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "For the roof repair. You said to go ahead with it, but you probably just forgot you approved it." I looked at the invoice. The company name was unfamiliar. The work described was extensive. It was also entirely fictitious. I'd been up on the roof myself the week before, inspecting the flashing around the chimney, and it was as sound as the day I'd installed it. The old Harrison, the man from a month ago, might have argued, might have gotten flustered, creating another scene for Joseph to use as evidence. But I wasn't that man anymore. I was playing a different game. Following Miller's advice, I calmly reached for the small leather-bound logbook I now carried everywhere. I opened it to the previous Tuesday. "Well now, Joseph," I said, my voice even and pleasant. "That's interesting, because according to my notes, on the day you're talking about, I was at the VFW hall from noon until 4 o'clock for the quarterly meeting. Here are the minutes." I turned the book around for Destiny to see. She looked from my neat, methodical handwriting to the invoice, and then to her husband. And for the first time, I saw it. Not doubt, not yet, but a flicker, a tiny hairline crack in the perfect facade of her trust. Later that evening, long after Destiny had gone upstairs to bed, Joseph found me in the living room. The polite, concerned son-in-law was gone. The mask was off. His face was a tight knot of fury, his voice a low hiss. "What do you think you're doing?" he whispered, his words sharp with menace. "You think that little book means anything? You're just making things harder on Destiny." I remained seated in my armchair, Margaret's favorite, and looked up at him. The fabric was worn smooth under my hands, a familiar comfort against the rising tension in the room. "I was just telling the truth, Joseph," I said, my voice quiet. My calmness seemed to infuriate him more than any shouting match could have. He was a creature who thrived on chaos and confusion. He fed on the fear and self-doubt of others. My refusal to be rattled, to be a victim, was taking his power away, and he couldn't stand it. He took a step closer, leaning over me, his presence filling the small space. "The truth?" he spat. "The truth is you're losing it, old man. You're a danger to yourself, and you're tearing this family apart with your stubbornness." The venom in his words was palpable. And then, in a sudden, ugly explosion of failed control, when his words could no longer find purchase, his hand came up. There was a sound, a sharp, dry crack that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. My head snapped to the side. A blooming electric pain flared across my cheek, followed by a dull, ringing sound in my ear. But more than the pain, more than the shock, there was a profound sense of disbelief. I had been in bar fights as a young man. I had faced down angry foremen on construction sites, but in the nearly 80 years of my life, no one had ever struck me like that, not with such contempt. And now, my son-in-law, in the house I had built, had just slapped me across the face. I slowly brought my hand up to my cheek, the skin already feeling hot and tight. My tongue probed the inside of my mouth, searching. Something was wrong. An incisor, one of my front teeth, a tooth that had chewed through decades of family dinners, that had been part of 1,000 smiles for my wife and daughter, was suddenly horribly loose. I could taste the sharp, coppery tang of blood. Joseph stood frozen, his hand still half raised, his eyes wide with a flicker of his own shock. He seemed stunned by the violence of his own action. I didn't mean to," he stammered, the words sounding hollow and pathetic in the heavy silence. But it was too late. A line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. He had escalated his campaign of whispers and lies into an act of physical violence, and in doing so, he had just handed me the one thing he had tried so hard to deny me: tangible, irrefutable proof, a wound that could not be explained away as a symptom of a failing mind. I said nothing. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. I simply stood up, my movements slow and deliberate, and walked past him into the bathroom. I flipped on the light and leaned over the sink, looking at my reflection in the mirror. My cheek was a raw, angry red, the faint outline of his fingers already beginning to form. I opened my mouth. I touched the tooth gently with my fingertip. It gave way with a sickening ease and fell, small and white and final, into the palm of my hand. I stared at it, lying there. Cold, hard, real. It was a piece of me, violently broken off, and looking back at my own reflection, at the man with the bruised face and the gap in his smile, I didn't see a victim. I didn't see a poor, confused old man. I saw a man who had been pushed to the absolute edge, and in that moment, all the hesitation, all the consideration I held for my daughter's feelings, it all evaporated. This wasn't about the house anymore. This wasn't about money or control. This was about my own safety, my own survival. And I knew, with a clarity as hard and cold as the tooth in my hand, exactly what I had to do next. My first stop in the morning would be the police station. After filing the report at the station and meeting with Miller again, the silence that followed was the heaviest I've ever known. The days stretched on, thick with an unspoken tension. I spent most of my time in the workshop, the familiar scent of sawdust and oil doing little to calm the frantic energy buzzing under my skin. My hands, usually so sure and steady, felt clumsy. I'd pick up a piece of oak, intending to work, only to find myself staring out the window, my mind miles away. Every car that passed on the street outside made me jump. I found myself constantly checking my phone, waiting for it to ring, my stomach twisting into a knot each time it remained dark and silent. It's an unsettling feeling, waiting for other people to deliberate on the facts of your own life. I tried to lose myself in the simple, repetitive motion of planning a board, focusing on the rhythmic scrape of steel on wood, trying to anchor my thoughts to something solid, something real. But the waiting was a current, always pulling me back under. The call finally came on a Thursday. It was Miller. This time he asked me to meet him at the city library. "The history section, second floor," he'd said. "It's quiet there." The location felt appropriate. The park had been for possibilities. The library, with its hushed solemn air and the weight of documented facts on every shelf, was for the truth. He was sitting in a secluded corner, a small table between two towering shelves of Civil War books. He looked more serious than our last meeting. He didn't waste any time on pleasantries. As I sat down, he pushed a thin, plain manila folder across the table toward me. "You need to see this, Mr. Davies," he said, his voice barely a whisper. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for it. It felt strangely light, too light to contain anything of consequence. I opened the cover. The first page was a copy of a marriage certificate, dated 6 years prior, from a county in Arizona. The groom's name was Joseph Miller. The bride's name was not Destiny. It was a ghost story told through the dry, impersonal language of legal documents, a story of a predator and his prey. Joseph's first wife had been a woman named Eleanor Vance, a wealthy widow 15 years his senior. Miller had compiled a timeline. First, the marriage. Then, within a year, reports from Eleanor's estranged sister noted a sudden decline in her health. 6 months after that, Eleanor sold her family home, a beautiful property Miller's notes indicated, and moved into an exclusive assisted living facility. Her finances, previously managed by herself, were placed under Joseph's control through a power of attorney. The final documents were the coldest. A death certificate citing complications from early onset Alzheimer's. She had died just over a year after selling her home, almost completely cut off from her few remaining relatives. There had never been an investigation. No formal accusations were ever made. On paper, it was all perfectly legal, a sad but not uncommon story of a woman's final years. But reading the stark, black and white facts, I could feel the cold, meticulous architecture of a perfectly executed plan. This wasn't a tragedy. It was a demolition. A chill, sharp and deep, snaked its way up my spine. This wasn't a random act of greed. I hadn't been a target of opportunity. I had been selected. I fit a profile. This realization shifted the entire landscape of my anger. The personal sting of betrayal began to fade, replaced by something far colder and more terrifying. I was a single data point in a repeating pattern. My near future had been written out for me in this file, a story that ended in isolation, loss, and a quiet, convenient death. I wasn't just fighting for my house or my dignity anymore. I felt a sudden, profound sense of duty to the woman in this file. Eleanor Vance, a woman whose story had been erased, whose final chapter had been written by the very man now sleeping under my daughter's roof. She'd had no one to gather evidence for her. She hadn't found her breaking point in time. I slowly closed the folder, the soft thud of the cover sounding like a judge's gavel in the silent library. "Thank you, Mr. Miller," I said, and when we shook hands this time, there was a different kind of energy in my grip. It wasn't the handshake of a client and his investigator. It was the handshake of two men who understood the stakes had just been raised to a level neither had anticipated. This information changed everything. This was no longer a sad family drama. This was about stopping a hunter before he could claim another victim. A purpose, clear and hard as steel, formed in my gut. The fear was gone, burned away by a cold rage and a heavy sense of responsibility. I knew exactly what I needed to do. Miller had given me the past. Now I had to get the evidence of the present. I had to build a bridge between the ghost in that file and the man in my house, a bridge so strong that no one could ever deny it was there. The folder Miller had given me was a map to the past, but I knew, with the certainty of a structural engineer looking at a stress fracture, that it wasn't enough. Not for the police, not for the world. The story of Eleanor Vance was a ghost story, and people are skeptical of ghosts. I needed to prove what was happening now, in the present. It would be my word, the word of an old man whose own daughter thought his mind was slipping, against the word of a charming, concerned son-in-law. An equation like that never balances. My mind started to work the way it always does when faced with a complex problem, not with emotion, but with logic. I defined the parameters. The objective: to capture Joseph's actions when he believed no one was watching. The constraint: he could not, under any circumstances, know he was being observed. The solution, when I stripped away all the noise, was simple, elegant even. I needed an eye, a hidden eye, a camera. The next day, I drove to a big box electronics store. Walking through the automatic doors felt like crossing a border into a foreign country. I was surrounded by towering walls of curved screen televisions, flashing colors too bright for nature, and sleek, glowing smartphones that looked more like alien artifacts than telephones. I felt 100 years old. I found the home security aisle, a dizzying display of blinking lights and promises of digital protection. There were cameras shaped like birds, cameras that could follow you around a room. It was all too much, too complicated. Then I saw it, tucked away on a lower shelf. It was a small, black, unassuming digital alarm clock. It looked exactly like the one I had on my bedside table, only this one had a tiny, nearly invisible lens hidden in the glossy face. It was perfect, harmless, ordinary. I picked up the box, feeling its weight in my hand. I paid for it at the self-checkout, using cash. Walking out of the store with the small paper bag, I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Control. It was a small act in the grand scheme of things, but it was mine. My decision, my action, my plan. You know, sometimes all this new technology can make a man feel like he's been left behind. But have you ever been in a situation where, to protect what truly matters, you had to learn to use a tool you never thought you'd need? I'd be interested to hear about it in the comments. Back home, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the box. I spread the contents out before me, the clock, a power cord, and a small folded sheet of instructions. I read every word twice. An engineer respects the manual. I followed the steps one by one, my old calloused fingers carefully navigating the small buttons. I set it up, linking it to an old tablet I rarely used. Then came the most important step, placement. I walked into the living room and surveyed the space like a general planning a battlefield. I needed the widest possible field of view. The mantelpiece. It was perfect. It overlooked the entire room, including my armchair, the one Joseph always sat in when he came over to have his little chats with me. I placed the clock on the mantel, right beside the silver-framed photograph of Margaret and me on our wedding day. There was a certain poetry to that. My wife, my silent witness, would now have an eye to see what I saw. I adjusted the angle slightly, checked the live feed on my tablet, and saw my own room staring back at me. It was a strange, unsettling feeling to see your sanctuary as a stage. But this was my territory, and I was finally using my own skills, my own mind, to defend it. The camera was active, the trap was set. And now came the hardest part of any engineering project, waiting for the stress test. Miller's words echoed in my mind. Be the forgetful old man he wants you to be. Every time Destiny and Joseph came over, it was a performance. I had to bite my tongue, feign confusion when he reminded me of things I'd never said, and nod along with a vacant look when he explained simple things to me. It was exhausting. It grated against every fiber of my being to pretend to be weak. But the thought of that tiny, silent lens on the mantelpiece gave me strength. It was my secret. My partner. I knew I couldn't let my emotions get the best of me. Patience, I reminded myself, is a tool. Just like a socket wrench or a screwdriver. You just have to know when to use it. A few days passed. Then, late one night, long after the house had settled into its usual quiet, I sat down with the tablet. My heart pounded in my chest as I started to review the recorded footage. I fast-forwarded through hours of an empty, silent room, sunlight moving across the floor, shadows lengthening, and then, there he was. Joseph had come into the house alone, using the key Destiny had given him. He thought I was out at my VFW meeting. The camera recorded it all. He walked directly to my writing desk in the corner of the room. He picked up a stack of my personal papers, the deed to the house, my insurance policies, my will. He laid them out one by one, and with a sickening casualness, took out his phone and began taking pictures of each page. After he was done, I saw his lips move. I turned up the volume. The microphone was surprisingly clear. It was his voice, low and conspiratorial. He's getting worse, he was saying to someone on the other end of the line. It won't be long now. A hot, white rage boiled in my blood, but beneath it, there was a profound, undeniable sense of relief. It wasn't just my word anymore. It wasn't a fuzzy memory or a gut feeling. It was there, captured, undeniable. It was the truth, recorded in ones and zeros. I met Detective Miller again, but this time it wasn't in a park or a library. It was at the police station, in a small, windowless room that smelled of stale coffee and bureaucracy. The air itself felt heavier here. I showed him the video from the digital clock. He watched the silent footage of Joseph rifling through my papers, his face impassive. But I saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. "That's good, Mr. Davies," he said, his voice low and serious. "That gives us probable cause. Now we can act." The plan they laid out was something straight out of a movie. They would fit me with a wire, a tiny recording device, and a nearly invisible earpiece. Miller and another detective would be parked down the street in an unmarked car, listening to everything, guiding me. The objective was clear: get Joseph to admit on tape to both the financial scheming and the physical assault. It was a surreal moment, sitting there in that sterile room. I was an 80-year-old retired engineer, and I was about to become the key player in a sting operation. Margaret would have never believed it. That evening, I picked up the phone to call Destiny. This was the part I dreaded the most. I had to consciously make my voice sound tired, frail, and confused. "Destiny, honey," I began, letting a slight waver into my words. "It's Dad. I've been doing a lot of thinking about what you and Joseph said. Maybe you're right. I'm just so tired of fighting it. Could you ask him to come over tomorrow? Just him. We should get this over with." I could hear the relief in her voice, a soft exhale of breath over the line. "Oh, Dad, I'm so glad. Of course I'll tell him." It felt like a knife in my gut, deceiving my own daughter like that. But I knew, with a grim certainty, that it was the only way to protect her from the man she'd married. The bait was set. The trap was laid. Joseph would walk through my door tomorrow, believing he was about to claim his final victory. He arrived alone the next afternoon, just as planned. He had a swagger in his step, a triumphant gleam in his eye that he couldn't quite conceal. I was sitting in my armchair, the digital clock on the mantelpiece watching, its silent lens capturing every detail. Miller's voice was a tiny, tinny whisper in my ear. "Stay calm, Mr. Davies. Just follow the script," I began, letting my hand tremble as I gestured to a stack of blank papers I'd placed on the coffee table. "I have the papers here, Joseph," I said, my voice sounding weak even to my own ears. "But I'm not sure where to sign." Joseph's smile was predatory. He strode over and picked up the top sheet, his condescension a thick cloak around him. "It's easy, Harrison. Right here on the bottom line. You just sign here and all your worries will be over. We'll take care of everything." He handed me a pen. I didn't take it. This was the moment. The tiny voice in my ear said, "Now, Mr. Davies, go now." I looked up at Joseph, letting my eyes look watery and scared. I raised a hand, not to the papers, but to my jaw. I rubbed it gently. It's still so sore right here, Joseph," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "From the other night, when your hand slipped. You won't do that again, will you? If I don't sign this right away?" Joseph froze. The triumphant smile vanished from his face, replaced by a flash of irritation. He looked at me, and his eyes were full of a dismissive, impatient contempt. "What are you talking about?" he snapped, his voice losing its smooth veneer. I pressed on, channeling every ounce of feigned fear I could muster. It's just, I'm scared. Are you going to hit me again? Make sure the rest of my teeth are loose before I sign? Arrogance and anger are a potent combination. They eclipse caution every time. A dry, humorless laugh escaped his lips. It was the sound of a man who believed he had absolute power. You deserved that last time, he spat, the words coming out before he could stop them. You were being stubborn, and you needed to be shown your place. It was a fatal mistake, a 3-word confession. The front door burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall. Detective Miller and 2 uniformed officers filled the doorway, their presence instantly changing the entire atmosphere of the room. I watched Joseph's face. It was a rapid, cinematic progression of emotions, from smug superiority to shocked confusion, then to dawning horror, and finally to the blank, hollow look of utter despair. The sharp metallic click-click of the handcuffs snapping around his wrists was the clearest, most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my life. And in that precise, perfectly orchestrated moment of justice, a car pulled into the driveway. My daughter, Destiny, walked in through the still open door, carrying a bag of groceries. She stopped dead. Her eyes took in the scene, her father sitting calmly in his armchair, her husband, his hands cuffed behind his back, flanked by 2 police officers, and Detective Miller, standing in the middle of the living room, holding a small recording device. The bag of groceries slipped from her grasp. Oranges and a carton of milk tumbled across the floorboards. But she didn't seem to notice. She just stared, her face a mask of utter devastation, as the world she thought she knew shattered into a million pieces right at her feet. The trial, when it happened, was swift. The audio recording, clear and undeniable, was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Joseph was convicted on multiple counts, from fraud to assault. I sat in the front row of the polished, solemn courtroom and listened to the verdict, but I didn't feel the sharp thrill of victory I had expected. There was no elation. There was only a profound and heavy sadness. I looked back over my shoulder at Destiny. She was huddled in the last row, small and broken, her face streaked with silent tears. Justice had been served. Yes, a predator had been stopped, but the cost was the ruin of a family, the shattering of my daughter's world. The gavel fell, its sharp crack echoing the sound of something breaking beyond repair. As the courtroom emptied, I remained in my seat, alone in the vast, silent room, feeling the immense weight of it all. A few days later, Destiny came to the house. She looked thin, her face pale and drawn. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Joseph had laid out his plans of conquest, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence was filled with everything that couldn't be said. Finally, she looked at me, her eyes brimming with a pain that mirrored my own. "Dad, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry I didn't believe you." What do you say to that? How do you patch a wound that deep? There are no words for it. So I just reached across the table and took her hand. It felt small and cold in mine. "It's okay, honey," I said, even though we both knew it wasn't. We both knew nothing was okay, but it was a start. A bridge across the chasm that had opened up between us. A silent promise that we would find our way back. They say time heals all wounds, but sometimes I think silence and a steady hand can do more than time ever could. In your own life, has there ever been a moment when you chose not to speak, but simply to let someone you love know that you were still there? I'd be honored if you shared it with us. Slowly, very slowly, life began to find a new rhythm. The house was mine again. The quiet was no longer menacing. It was peaceful. I spent more and more time in my workshop. The familiar hum of the lathe, the steady scrape of a hand plane over a piece of oak, These were the sounds that helped me sort through the wreckage in my own mind. They were the sounds of something being made true again. Destiny started stopping by more often. She wouldn't stay long at first. She didn't talk much about what happened. She would just sit on a stool in the corner of the workshop, watching me work, a warm cup of coffee in her hands. Some days I'd look out the window and see her in the garden, tending to the rose bushes Margaret had planted decades ago. She was weeding, pruning, bringing things back to life. We were healing together, not through long, tearful conversations, but through small, quiet acts of presence. We were rebuilding, side by side, in the silent language of shared space. One afternoon, I looked over at the unfinished rocking chair, the one I had started for her all those weeks ago, before the storm broke. I decided it was time to finish it. I took my time. I sanded every surface until it was as smooth as river stone. I applied a new coat of tung oil, rubbing it deep into the grain, watching the wood's character and warmth return. I worked on it every day, and with each layer of finish, it felt like I was restoring something within myself, too. When it was finally done, it was more beautiful than I remembered. It shone with a soft, deep luster, strong and steady. The next Sunday, when Destiny came over, I led her out to the front porch. "This is for you," I said simply. She looked at the chair, her eyes tracing the familiar curves. She ran a hand over the smooth armrest. She sat down, and with a gentle push of her foot, began to rock back and forth, a slow, comforting rhythm. She didn't say a word, but I saw her shoulders begin to shake, and I knew she understood. Watching my daughter there, rocking gently in the late afternoon sun, I had a moment of clarity. I realized what a man's true legacy is. It isn't a house built of wood and nails. It isn't the money in a bank account. It's the memories you build. It's the love you give. It's the strength to stand back up after you've been knocked down, and the grace to help the people you love do the same. My story holds a great deal of pain, but it's also a story about finding my own voice when I thought it was lost forever. And I hope, in telling it, that it might reach someone else out there who is feeling silenced, alone, and powerless. I hope it lets them know that they are not alone, and that even when the very foundation of your world seems to have crumbled, there is always a way to rebuild. And rebuilding, I've found, isn't something a man has to do alone. That's why I'm sitting here talking with you today. I know that when we men, those of us who've seen more than a few seasons pass, get together, the stories can flow like a river. Today, I wanted to open my heart a little, and I'd be truly honored to hear your stories in return. You know, sometimes it's just a simple click, a like, a subscribe, or a share that might seem like a small passing gesture to many. But to me and to other quiet voices that need to be shared, every one of those clicks is a light in the dark. It says, "I see you, I hear you, your story has value." Now that I've shared my story, what I'd like most is to listen to what's on your minds. In the comments below, I would be truly honored if you would share a piece of your own story. Was there a time you felt dismissed or unheard? Is there a passion you have that others might have called foolish? Or what was a moment when you found your own strength, even in a quiet way? Please share them. I will read them, and I will carry them with me, because your stories matter. WAWA Ages wants to build a community where we men, fathers, grandfathers, can share our real experiences, the good and the bad. If you don't have something heavy to share today, then maybe just share a small joy. What made you smile today? If you're watching this on your television, don't hesitate to pick up your phone and find my channel, WAWA Ages. Let's build this place together, A community where no man has to feel like his life, his struggles, and his victories are invisible. Thank you for sitting with me. It means more than you know.